It's 1914. You just learned that your country's at war and now you're excited to join. So you go down to your enlistment office, you sign up with you and a couple of your buddies, and within a couple of weeks, you're off going towards the front. You're going not only to fight for your country, but also to experience what soldiers in the past have experienced, the thrill of battle, the search for glory. However, will you find glory and honor and victory on the battlefield in World War I? Hi, my name is Justin, aka Ghost Shooter, and today we are going to talk about the life of a soldier in World War I. This is part of my Remembering the First World War series, and you can find links to other videos at the end of this video and also down in the description box below. So what was life like for a soldier in World War I? Now for this video, I'm going to focus mainly on the Western Front, but I will mention some of the other fronts as well that occurred in the war. Now when the war began, it was a war of movement. You had the Germans trying to push into France and take Paris, and in the east you had the Russians trying to invade Germany. Now if you were a German soldier at the beginning of the war, you were put on a train and you were at your position ready to go as soon as the war started. The goal of your unit was to get to Paris as soon as possible, so you marched 15 to 20 kilometers a day to get to Paris. For the French and British soldiers, they were trying to put up a desperate defense, and once the Germans came on them hard, they ended up having to fall back and were marching just as fast as the Germans were, trying to keep ahead of them. Finally, when the French and English troops stopped the German army, they settled down for about 4 years of trench warfare. This meant that both sides were basically staring at each other across no man's land, trying to figure out how to break through enemy lines. So what did this mean for soldiers? Well, if you were on the defense, this probably meant a really big artillery barrage. And as the war went on, these artillery barrages got longer and even more deadlier. Now these artillery barrages were intense, and they actually sounded like drums because they were being fired so often. Just sounded like a steady beat of a drum. And some men actually broke down under artillery barrage, just their nerves were shot, and basically it's because you were constantly in danger of a unseen shell coming, exploding in your trench, either killing you directly or you getting buried under dirt. Now once the barrage had ended, you then knew that the enemy was coming. So if you hadn't abandoned your front lines, then you stood up, got ready to defend your trenches. Now this meant getting into position with your machine guns and rifles in order to defend your trenches and push the enemy back. Now if you were lucky, the enemy had not destroyed the barbed wire in front of your trenches. This made them an open target then once they came to your barbed wire, because they then had to cut their way through in order to get to you. If the enemy did reach your trench, you put up a desperate defense and fought with whatever you had at hand. Rifles, grenades, trench shovels, knives, bayonets, whatever you had at hand to push the enemy back. And while there were some successes during the 4 years on the Western Front, for the most part the lines remained pretty much static. So if you were a soldier in the offensive, the odds against your success were very high. Now while the enemy were waiting for you to come across the field, you yourself had to get yourself ready to cross no man's land and basically walk into machine gun and artillery fire. Now as you moved forward towards enemy lines, you did hope that your artillery did destroy the barbed wire, so you had an easier chance to get through, maybe even knock out a few machine gun nests. The less men that you had to run into in the enemy lines, the more chances you had of surviving. So you not only had to worry about the enemy in front of you, but you also had to worry about the enemy behind you, because if the artillery got their firing solution wrong, they could actually end up landing shells amongst their own troops and then killing some of their own. And this was true not only for those on the offensive, but those also in the defensive as well. Now if you were on the offensive and you actually did capture an enemy trench, then you hoped that your artillery was moving forward, because you needed your artillery support in order to kind of help you break through. And for a lot of these offenses, what usually happened is by the time the artillery was brought up to support troops, the enemy had staged a counterattack and ended up pushing the men who had taken those trenches, usually in the morning, pushed them back to their own trenches by that afternoon or that evening. So a lot of this attacking and counterattacking, biting and holding onto position, this went on for 4 years, and basically it was just men kind of caught in the grinder. And this wasn't just because you had inept generals, and there were inept generals and people in the Army Chief of Staff who were inept and didn't learn lessons from each of the battles. But also, the generals were learning the lessons just as well as the men were. And even if a general did adapt to the changing situation on the ground and put into practice lessons he had learned, usually he would have success in the beginning. But the enemy would then adapt to his tactics, and then you ended up right back in the meat grinder where you were before. So soldiers lived in fear also of gas attacks, and gas attacks were perhaps one of the most feared attacks on the Western Front, because usually by the time you smelled it, if you didn't notice it in time, it usually affected you and you became a casualty of war. So also making sure that you had a gas mask on you and that your gas mask worked could mean the difference between life and death. But soldiers weren't always fighting on any front in the war. And a lot of these fronts, if you weren't in the main thick of it, while there would be like some artillery battles, maybe some shooting shots at each other every now and then, a lot of times you were trying to figure out a way to fight off the boredom. Well, in these trenches, there was definitely work to do. You were repairing your trenches, you're making sure that your barbed wire was still intact, you're making sure that the your defenses were in order, patrols were set up, reconnaissance done. But for the most part, you were trying to figure out how to survive day to day, not only from enemy, sudden attacks, but also from the elements, because for a lot of the time you were out in the cold, in the heat, in the rain. On the Western Front in Belgium, mud and rain slowed down a lot of the defenses and made life hell for a lot of the soldiers. And in the east, the cold was also a nuisance, but was also deadly, with the cold killing a lot of troops there as well. And if you were fighting in the Middle East, you didn't have to worry about your water supplies and the heat and possible heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and things like that. But in the trenches on the Western Front, you were also fighting a losing war in most cases against rats and lice. There's a scene in All Quiet on the Western Front where the soldiers basically leave out food purposely so the rats will come so they could kill them. And so rats and lice were a constant nuisance as well. And trying to keep clean also in the situation where basically you're in the mud and dirt all day was a nuisance for a lot of these men. Also, keeping your feet dry was also another troubling thing, and one common element that a lot of men got was trench foot from their feet constantly being wet. But also another thing was that you were surrounded by the dead and dying. If you were on the trenches in the Western Front and you, after an offensive or after you took offensive action, men could be left out in no man's land, and you wouldn't be able to go out and get them, because if you did, you risk getting shot. And there are actually stories of people who took it upon themselves to go out and help their fellow soldiers and bring them back safely to their own lines. But in a lot of these cases, help could not reach these men, and they died, unfortunately, alone in no man's land. Now, if you were wounded and you were rescued and not left out in no man's land, you made it back to your own lines, you were put on a stretcher, and then you were either put onto an ambulance or into like a horse with a wagon, and you were transported to a hospital where you could get help. Now, there were a lot of amputations that had to be done because of the weapons being used in this era. And also, doctors were fighting infections at a time when they didn't have antibiotics. So if you got an infection, it could be a very dangerous thing. Now, war has always been stressful, but the Great War, the First World War, took it to a totally different level. Now, back in the past, if you were a soldier and you were fighting, you usually marched out to battle. You did your battle, maybe battle for a couple of days, and there was a winner and loser, and then you either ran off and retreat or you kept campaigning. But in the First World War, battles could last for weeks and months, and you're under constant artillery barrage. There's a constant chance of you getting shot at or killed, and this actually messed up a lot of soldiers mentally. Now, for these men who were messed up by the war mentally, these men were experiencing what doctors were calling shell shock. Today, we would call that PTSD, but back then, the nature of this illness was not really understood, and a lot of these men were just simply seen as cowards and not wanting to go back into the line. So with all the horror experienced during the war, whether that be at places like the Western Front, where you're fighting trench warfare, at Gallipoli, which was a disaster for the Anzac troops that were sent there, or if you were in Salonika, Greece, where thousands of men, Allied soldiers, were getting malaria, you were experiencing some terrible thing in the war. So how did soldiers get through this? So I think it was basically the patriotism and the fact that you had your brothers in arms around you, that you not only had a duty to your peers that were with you in battle, but also a duty to the people back at home, that kept a lot of these men fighting for their countries even when the situation was really bad. However, that can only take men so far. In 1917, the French soldiers basically mutinied and said that they would not go on the offensive. And this is because they had seen a lot of the offensives that they had been in basically fail and taken a lot of casualties forward. In the end, General Pétain of the French army was able to quell the mutiny. 554 of the mutineers were sentenced to death, but 90% of those sentences were commuted. Now, because of the mutiny, Pétain promised that the soldiers would have home leave, that troops that were exhausted would get rest, that there would be no more suicide attacks, and that discipline would be more moderate. Russian soldiers began to vote with their feet and decided that they weren't going to fight anymore, and decided to go home, because Russia was also experiencing a social revolution as well as fighting the war. And I'll talk more about that in my video on the rise of communism in Russia. Now, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose army was made up of troops from many different ethnic minorities, it was being said that a lot of their troops, or at least it was feared that a lot of the ethnic minorities were joining the Allies without even putting up a fight. And by 1918, German troops on the Western Front were pretty much exhausted, especially since they knew that more and more American troops would be arriving and that they would have to fight them or face them in battle as well, and that really put a dampener on morale. However, with all the horrors that were seen, for the most part, most men stayed in the line and did their duty. 65 million soldiers would participate in this war, and 8.5 million men would die, and many millions more would be wounded, captured, or would go missing during World War I. With those numbers, it's really easy to get lost in just looking at the number of people who were either involved or were killed and forget that they're people. And with numbers as large as that, you can get lost in the numbers. You can just see numbers and casualty lists and not realize these are actual men. It was Stalin who said one death is a tragedy, a million is just a statistic. And I think that's because our brains can't really wrap itself around that many numbers of men being killed, that many people being gone. And what I wanted to do in this video was point to these soldiers and say, these are real men with real stories who sacrificed a lot, sacrificed spending Christmases with their family, missing seeing their first child born, and some never ever seeing their families again. And as we near the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, I just wanted to remember these soldiers as men, as individuals, and also to say thank you to those in the armed services who still fight and sacrifice for us today. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos from me, please subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at GhostReads28 and also on Goodreads. The link to that is down in the description box below. So as always, keep reading.